Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the loving neighbor kinds of Christians and not the storm of the capital kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I'm your host. I am a professor of theology and the lead pastor of the Loft Worship Community at Westwood United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, California. I want to invite you to please rate, review, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff to our podcast on whatever platform you are listening or watching, as we are now on YouTube. So please, if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel if you'd like to see our mostly beautiful faces. I will never speak of myself in that way, but the other three participants in the podcast are all very attractive. If you want to look at us, feel free to watch us on YouTube. And we would love for you again to subscribe. In today's episode, we will be discussing parenting, broadly speaking, and the impact of our current administration on some of the policies that impact our children, the ways in which this is theologically influenced, and also we're going to be ending with a conversation that got started from a letter we received from a podcast listener, which has given us an idea for an episode series that we are going to be doing. Today, I am grateful to be joined by Julia and Reverend Blair. How are y'all doing this morning?
Making it
with a new haircut.
Yeah.
It's cute.
It's in there.
You look great.
It's hiding behind my headphones, but it's in there.
It's cute.
Did I cut it myself at home because I did not want to pay someone $250 to cut my curly hair in Los Angeles? Yes,
Ooh.
I did.
$250?
Would I do it again? Probably not. I probably would not cut my own hair again. But we're in it. We're living with it. Hair grows back.
Hair grows back. You said it looked like, what's the character? You said...
Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Yeah. Yep. That's actually, I can kind of, you could do that for Halloween if you cut your hair like that. Totally, 100%.
Yeah,
I
I
see
can
that.
definitely pull off a Rachel Brosnahan.
And Julia, I know you're not feeling your best.
Still recovering. I mean, listen, recovered enough to go to Beyonce tonight.
Well, there you go. I'd have to be having COVID and almost dead not to go see Beyonce. So
I was stressed and I missed all of the good things. I missed the LA Times Festival of Books.
Oh, that was this weekend. Yeah.
I missed a few good things already. Everyone went to see Sinners last week, which I heard was excellent.
Yeah.
I couldn't go. So not missing Beyonce. Enough is enough.
I was going to go to see Sinners until I saw that it was like a horror movie, and I was like, I'm out. I don't be doing that. So I'm going to wait to watch that at home. I know. It's like I've heard all the it's like.
Did you see Get Out?
I did.
And you thought that was too scary?
I saw Get Out at home also.
But no, was that very scary to you?
No, it's like, this is where trauma is helpful to talk about, like just my own, life experiences, such that I remember, I think I must have been in my late teens when I was telling one of my friends that I have seen enough violence and I've been scared enough in real life. I don't need to go pay money to be scared. And that's just, I was like, I don't need to do that. I'd be like, I'm good. But I want to see it in part because I want to support. I almost want to buy a ticket and not even go, just to be down for the cause, man. Just be like, you know what? I hate how they talking about this. They making it sound like he got some kind of movie deal that hasn't been done before, but it has been given before. Maybe it has been given to a black person before in terms of owning the rights after 25 years and that other kind of stuff. So it's been maybe it's not
about Ryan Coogler.
Ryan Coogler, yeah.
That he has like a multi-picture deal.
Yeah, maybe this is hot in the LA streets. I don't know if it's hot in, people from all over maybe they're not hearing all of it because it definitely is a buzz out here. So
when I saw Get Out, everyone had been telling me how terrifying it was. It was so scary. And then I went and I watched it and I was like, this is just what it's like to be around white people. Like, what are people so afraid of? And so I've been told that some Sinners is similar to that, where it's like when people say it's scary, it's only scary for like certain people. Otherwise, it's just like regular.
Okay. All right.
So I don't know. I haven't seen it. I was sick. I missed it.
Okay. All right. Well, we missed you on Sunday, and we're glad you're feeling better.
Well, hopefully I'll feel better.
You'll feel
feeling
better
better than
after
I
the concert
was.
tonight. You'll feel better after the concert tonight.
I'll feel better at some point.
I so I do want to have a disclaimer before we get started with the actual podcast. Is we are recording earlier in the week because our wonderful editor has a big conference that he'll be working at later this week and be super busy. He won't be able to get all of our things edited in time. So we're recording on Monday for a Friday release. So if Trump does anything extra crazy, if something extra
Completely
crazy
insane.
happens, we'll probably just end up doing like some like live clips. Honestly, it's probably gonna end up doing like something I can just chop up and edit myself and put on social media. Let's just hope nothing like that happens. Let's hope nothing like that happens, unless he like resigns or something. Then it'd be great, but I doubt that's happening. So on to today's topic. Blair, did you want to say a little bit about kind of what we were going to discuss, or kind of, the first thing we're going to talk about is RFK Jr. and the way he's been speaking about autism specifically, but also in general, how he's been running the agency. And the reason this was interesting to us, I guess, in part, is because both of us are parents, and Julia is involved in all of our children's lives in many ways, and so this has been particularly important for us for different reasons. So I'll let you share a little bit about why it's important to you and kind of get the conversation started.
Yeah, before I became a pastor, I was in school to be an occupational therapist. I don't know if you know that. And my
I
mom
did
is an
know that.
occupational therapist, and my aunt is an occupational therapist. And I went to USC, which is the number one occupational therapy school in the country. And both my mom and my aunt were really involved in like very early development of research on sensory integration through occupational therapy, which is a really big thing that has supported kids with all sorts of special development support needs, but specifically within autism. And so I have like a little bit of a therapeutic background in this because then I dropped out and went to seminary. It's a whole story. But then because I was attuned to this when I had my son, and he had delayed speech, he did not have verbal expressive words until we started speech therapy. And I think he had his first word was ball at like 14 or 15 months, which is pretty late. And so he was in early intervention. And around 2, I just saw some like sensory needs that I was aware of because of my therapeutic background. And he was just a kid who was always like crashing into things and really had trouble calming down. Just felt like his body was go, 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 go all the time. And so I just said to his EI therapist, I was like, hey, should we just do a screening for autism? Just, let's just see. And she's like, yeah, let's do it. And so we got enrolled in a study at Harvard, actually. The wait list to get a screening for autism in Massachusetts at the time, which is where we were living, was like 18 months. And this study at Harvard, we got in and got an evaluation within 2 months because we signed him up for that. And we did an evaluation at my child has an autistic brain. And so we got our diagnosis at about 2.5 months and have been able to provide like fantastic supports for him, a lot of early intervention. Most people, when they meet him, they don't know that he has any kind of developmental difference. But when you live with him all the time, there's certain tools we know help my beloved son be successful in a world that's not built for him. And we work on that all the time. So it's a huge part of my life. And I am lucky that I have enough of a background in therapy that I can serve as like a really good advocate for him and be essentially like an educated caseworker. But it's hard. It's hard work to make sure he gets what he needs to be successful. And it's something my husband has had to learn how to do. And when RFK started flapping his mouth 2 weeks ago about autistic kids at the same time that they were deporting people, just like taking them off the streets and sending them to a foreign country, I just sort of put 2 and 2 together of like, oh, there is now rhetoric about autistic kids and they are disappearing people. And it seems in this administration, whether or not the rhetoric they choose is actually good policy, wherever the rhetoric goes, the policy goes. And so now, as a mom of a kid with autism, I'm starting to get real anxious about protecting my kiddo, because having a diagnosis has meant we get access to the things we need for him to be successful in life. But him having a formal diagnosis also means he's on lists. His IEP, this research study, like he's on lists. And so if this administration decides that they can take better care of kids with autism than their parents can, I'm worried about that. And so this has just been a very, I told my like personal story on this, but it's been a very concerning thing to see rising in the news in the last few weeks. And I know I'm not the only parent out there who's concerned about this.
No, thank you so much for sharing, Blair. And it's scary because I think what maybe people don't know, and maybe people listen to our podcast too, because you know, um, the kind of people who might listen to something like this might actually be a bit more educated around issues of history. But when you look at what happened in Nazi Germany or in the Soviet Union, these countries where you experienced any kind of genocide or trying to or social stratification hierarchy in that way, disabled people are always a part of that group, right? And so disabled people were put into concentration camps regardless of their religious affiliation, because again, this is a part of the broader eugenics movement. And so because of this, it was all about having, good seed, fertile soil, all those kind of, ironically, the same kind of agricultural and environmental metaphors that went into building up our, even within an American context, went into building up the outsized early, turn to the 20th century efforts to have like in what we would call like contemporary environmentalism. So our national parks and all those things. A lot of the founders of that were eugenicists, and they were using eugenics arguments to do this. So by this I mean to build up the environmental movement, or I should say, not the environmental movement, but the infrastructure that allowed for the creation of national parks and preservation of lands and things of that nature. It was all for the idea of creating something that's pure, that's idyllic, that's beautiful. And they use those kind of ideologies to disappear, to take away people who are disabled and put them, so they wouldn't have kids, or sterilize them in various ways. This is the unfortunate history, in not just America, to be clear. Like, this not just happened here. This was happening for the most part in Europe as well. So this isn't like some far-fetched idea. This happened here, and particularly, actually, I should say, before I stop, I should mention that it happened really particularly with respect to the eliminating the possibility for people to have children, and women of color, indigenous women in Puerto Rico experienced it statistically the worst in the country, in American history. Obviously racist too. So there's a history of this, I guess, what I want to say, of this happening, and it is scary. I think
And
that.
in
Oh, go ahead, Blair.
I was just going to say, and I told my personal story, but in RFK's remarks too, that kind of launched this conversation in the last few weeks, is talking about how I know I used has autism or autistic child, right? So we've talked about person first language or diagnostic language, but RFK is talking about autism like it's like this horrendous disease, and he said like ruins people's lives. Autism destroys families, he said, and is an individual tragedy as well. And also just shared a lot of misinformation about. He said, these are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And while there are comorbidities with autism, an autism diagnosis that may result in severe developmental disability where people aren't able to do those things, those are the minority of cases of people who have an autistic neurotype, and usually are actually accompanied with a different kind of developmental disability. but we don't know a lot. Like, we're still learning. We're still learning how the autistic brain works. We're still learning how all sorts of different kinds of developmental disabilities happen, neuro disabilities, and how they manifest. But RFK was just out. He was just out here saying things that are just abundantly untrue. They're lies. They're lies about people who have autistic neurotypes, and they're lies about people who have all sorts of disabilities, as if people who are disabled cannot contribute to the world. And disability is, as you were tying it to like these other areas of minoritized people and identities, disability is the one sort of minority group that any person could join at any time. And so that's also, I think, why it's important for us to talk about it early in this process so that we can be aware as things start to shift and as the rhetoric starts to shift.
Not only can anyone join it, but like if you live long enough, you absolutely 100% will become part of it. Like, I mean, listen, like, yes, you might live till 97 and die peacefully in your sleep, like running and after having run a marathon the day before. That is absolutely possible. But like most of us
in this country with our water and our food,
with this
Probably
healthcare, at some point we just start to need assistance. I'm genuinely confused about the list of things that these children will never be able to blah, 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 blah. But like, I don't understand. I mean, beyond paying taxes, which like, okay, sir, people are for more than that. But like, I don't understand why it's bad.
it's only bad in a capitalist society that says
Oh, that's right.
people exist for what they can
if you
produce.
Can't, if you're not productive.
And if you can't produce in the way that the capitalist system wants you to, then you are not of value.
You're worthless.
And it only works in a racist society that says bodies are supposed to be shaped in a certain way and look a certain way for them to be valuable. Because like some of these things have been said about people of color too, that like, well, they can't hold a job. They're not smart enough to read or write. Like these are also things that have been applied to ethnic and racial folks, minorities as well. And so some of it's just rhetoric. It's just rhetoric of control.
And actually, I want to read some of so this is an article from CBS that basically kind of pushes back on some of the, quite honestly, just conspiracy theories and lies. Like, I think Wesley, who couldn't be with us today, is the one who's really got me. I've tried to stop saying misinformation because I feel like that does soften it and be like, oh no, they're just lying. They're straight up telling a lie, not telling the truth. And so one of the critiques in this article that's pushing back on some of the things that RFK said. So this is, quote, Kennedy said many autistic children were, quote, fully functional and then regressed into autism when they were 2 years old. And these kids are the people who never pay taxes, hold a job, et cetera, et cetera. He also said that most cases are now severe. 25% of the kids who are diagnosed with autism are nonverbal, non-toilet trained, and have other stereotypical features. But medical experts, along with people on the autism spectrum, told PolitiFact that Kennedy's portrayal was skewed. A 2023 study written by CDC officials and university researchers found that 1/4 of people on the autism spectrum have severe limitations, but this is on the high end of studies, and many people in that 1/4 of the autism population do not have the limitations Kennedy mentioned. The vast majority of people on the spectrum do not have these severe challenges. And I think, that's been my experience, full transparency. Like we've done a lot of work at our church with respect to being an inclusive space for people with disabilities. It's been really important for myself in terms of trying to change the way we talk about it, think about it theologically. If you're watching us on YouTube, you'll notice I have several books about the intersection of theology and disability behind me. And we had a workshop yesterday on like for people specifically run by organization for folks with autism, but in general talking about people with different various neurotypes and neurodivergences. And so for me, a lot of this from a theological perspective, it comes down to the simple fact of actually seeing other people as creating the image of God. And do you see them as a full human being? And do you actually and not having pity for them, right? Not thinking that like, oh, you know, that this isn't how God created them to be, or any of these other kinds of bad, I think, theological positions that people can have. That's like, oh, if you pray hard enough, or if you believe enough, and if you're living right, you wouldn't have this condition. Rather, recognizing that there are any number of reasons why people have disabilities, and that it is not our responsibility to give someone some kind of diagnostic treatment. Rather, it is to be their neighbor and to love them and to create a space of hospitality and create a space of care. To make sure that they feel like a whole seen person and that they can be their full best selves, and ask ourselves, how might we create a community that does that? That to me is the most important aspect of what we should be doing in terms of how we create a space for folks who are disabled, whether they be intellectually disabled or physically disabled. And I think what frustrates me about the portrayal of people like Kennedy is they talk about it as though these people not only are less like not fully human beings, but as though we should have pity for them, right? Rather than actually creating a society where they can actually be their best full selves. And I just don't believe pity is the answer. Compassion, yes. Pity, no.
Well, the assumption is that something is wrong with them. And I've said this so many times. I have a father who's disabled. He was not always disabled. He became disabled as he aged. And a thing that I've realized is that people assume that because disabled people struggle in the world, it means that something's wrong with them, as opposed to when you know someone and you love someone who is disabled, it is very easy to see the way that the world fails them. Like it's easy for me to see that like my father's disability only makes him disabled because of the unreasonable things that the world around him does, that the world doesn't have to do. Like the world could be more accommodating to someone with his disability. It just isn't because, I mean, just for no good reason, really.
Because it's cheaper for it not to be.
Or even if it's not, like I do think that sometimes we say like cruelty is the point. Like ways to punish people who are different. And I often wonder when it is that we learn that these sorts of differences are inherently bad. And like, what if I love reading about indigenous cultures where they believe that these sorts of like that there have been cultures in the world that would believe that any sort of disability is actually a blessing. And it's like a gift from God because those people can show us different things about the world that we who are able-bodied would not be able to see or understand. Those with different minds and experiences show us different things about humanity and about ourselves that we otherwise would not be able to know or understand. Like that to me is a much more interesting way to observe difference than, oh, you're not this specific thing, then that means that you are bad. That God made you bad. God failed when she made you.
Just the idea that difference is holy, I think, is a huge part of progressive Christianity, is that we don't want to all be the same. We want to be different because of, as you said, what it shows us about who God is. But I also want to acknowledge some of the language that's been used here about trying to discover the causes of autism and then the cures for autism. And I want to acknowledge that within the disability community, all sorts of different kinds of disability, this is like that there is not agreement on whether or not people want to be cured, whether or not people want to know the causes of things. Because the reality is people who have severe support needs yeah, they would probably like for there to be some kind of cure for life to be easier. And I get that. And then I'm in a place of privilege in having a disabled child, but a disabled child who has very low support needs. He is able to do tasks of daily life. He's able to be in a mainstream classroom. He's able to speak and communicate using traditional English communication. So I recognize that within the community, I have a lot of privilege, and I would not change my child. I wouldn't change him. He's great. Even the hard days, again, teach us something. But that's not everybody's experience with disability. And so, before we talk more about why this language of cause and cure is dangerous, I want to acknowledge that the disability community is not all on the same page about that. But what I'm concerned about right in this moment is, as RFK is talking about discovering the cause of autism and now has announced this huge NIH study after pulling all of this money from scientific organizations
NIH,
across the
exactly.
country, is now pumping $300 million a year into, and is going to increase that into studying autism, and has declared that he will have a cure for autism by September. And here's two things. One, I don't think there is a cure for autism because it's a neurotype. You might be able to adjust people's behavior, but actually changing somebody's brain is going to be, he's not going to do that by September. But what I'm concerned about historically is that by September, he's going to have done a huge study. And this is what some other autism parents are scared of. He's going to have done this huge study, accessed the data and resources from autism researchers across the country, have a huge database and list of people with autism. And then when he declares that they have a cure, the very easy rhetorical argument is to say, we're going to bring them all into institutions and give them this cure because we know how to care for them better than their parents do or better than their local communities do. And any rhetorical excuse this government can come up with, we've seen them do it with immigrants to disappear people, they're going to use. And so I see the clear pathway there where I could potentially lose my child. And I know that seems alarmist, but this language is really dangerous because it can be used that way. And I want people to be paying attention to it and not to think that it sounds perfectly reasonable, because they're going to take something that seems perfectly reasonable and maybe even altruistic and turn it into a way to isolate, remove, and potentially harm or disappear people we love.
Language is so important right now, I think, in part because, and it's part of the reason we've been arguing and fighting so much about recognizing the rights of people that people have, their constitutional rights to due process. And we've been, Blair, I saw you had posted on social media a response to someone who had commented on one of our posts with respect to the deportation of immigrants. And, we're like, we have all the context we can have on the podcast. We're like, oh, this is the deportation, of people who are here legally, regardless. And then people are like, well, if they're illegal, they can't have not committed a crime if they're here and they came here illegally. And I'm like, that's not what we're talking about. Like, they're deporting people here who are here legally, and they're violating people's constitutional rights. And but people don't want to either listen critically to what we're actually saying, or they are willing to see this as something, broadly speaking, as altruistic or something that ought to be done because it's the law. And so this is critical right now, because every right that we give away is something that are going to be more difficult to get back. Like in the beginning of fascism, like this is what happens. Like, as they take away your rights, that is something that we have seen happen in these other countries, that every time something gets taken away, it's harder and harder to claw a little bit of it back. And so making sure people understand how to read, how to think critically, making sure we're being very plain about what we're saying, is something we're trying to do on this podcast because it's really, really important to us. Julia, I know you got something to say.
I also just think it's easy to know what their end goal is because they've already said it. Right? Like, they've said it multiple times. Like, when they say, like, we want to make America great again, like it was from 1940 to 1950, like, That's just a very clear end goal. And it makes, if you look at that as like, that's the finish line, then it means that everything that they do between then and there is like something to get us closer to that. So it's not just, they're not just doing random things because they just want to be cruel, which they do want to be cruel, but it's also, these people are eugenicists. Like, these people do believe in like a white majority. Like, they do believe in purity and idealism when it comes to like physicality and like the way that our brains function. Like, they do believe that like there is a right way to be and that everything else is wrong. And that is how they're governing. That is part of what Project 2025 is. That's all. I mean, it's scary.
And I want to circle back too about the question of rights, right? Because it's a difficult balance, because part of the rhetoric around autism is based on a very now old from 1998, which doesn't seem like it's that old, but it's pretty old, 1998 study from England that made a link between autism and vaccines. And this study has been debunked over and over and over again. Like, the thing about the scientific method is, for something to be accepted by science, it has to be repeatable. And nobody has ever been able to repeat and prove. That's how you prove something within the scientific method, is you repeat it and have the same results occur. And that's the way you can say this is a pattern. Nobody's been able to repeat this pattern of proving that there's a link between autism and vaccines. And in reality, the study has also been debunked because it, like, the methodology it was put forward. Anyway, the whole point is there's this one study that has been blown into this huge claim that giving your kids vaccines will give them autism. So one, that requires you to think that having autism is a problem, or being autistic is a problem, which, again, with, severe support needs, I completely understand that I would also not want my child to have severe support needs. And if there was something I could do to prevent that from happening, I would. I don't let my kid like run headfirst into the ball pit, because if he gets a spinal fracture, that's fundamentally going to change our lives, right? So I understand the want and the desire to protect our kids. But this is a false claim that has actually led to kids dying, because in the fear of your children having autism, people have stopped giving them vaccines that save their lives. And so now we have such a momentum of this anti-vaccine rhetoric that we have an outbreak in the United States of measles. We have over 900 cases of measles active in the United States right now. That was a disease that was eradicated by vaccines. And now it's becoming a little epidemic. Particularly West Texas is having this huge outbreak. And this is where this question of rights comes in, right? Is because we want to respect people's rights and parents' rights to decide what goes into and onto their children's bodies. But vaccines only work if we all play, if we all play the game. And if we don't, then kids who can't get vaccines because they have allergies, or kids who can't get vaccines because they're immunocompromised, like there's reasons you can't be vaccinated. But when people choose not to vaccinate because of lies, that actually ends up harming more people. And so it's this weird balance of trying to figure out who gets to decide these things and when and how.
This also comes back again to the question of language. And this is something, Dr. Carter, you pointed out in the past, that when people have that initial response of like, oh, I don't want to vaccinate my kids because they'll get autism, is like incredibly ableist. And the pejorative way in which that we generally so casually degrade any body, any mind that has any sort of difference, the way that it like trickles down and affects everything else. Like, you don't like disabled people, but you're okay because what's going to happen if your baby gets polio? Because let me tell you something.
They will be disabled for life.
They will be,
right? Like,
yeah, I was like, just,
like-
yep.
like I don't, and again, like what if there's nothing wrong with being disabled to begin with?
And at its core, that's actually to me the theologically interesting part, is that there's a way in which we view disabled bodies as fundamentally flawed and broken. Something about them. One of my graduate students, who I know listens to the podcast, and so I won't say her name, but she is eventually going to be doing a PhD because she is brilliant, and I want to have her on the podcast at some point. She is writing a paper that broadly could be best described as I guess what she would describe as a fat liberation theology. And it's so cool because she's talking about just fat bodies. We talk about bodies, and she's doing an exegetical work on 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul's talking about the body. And it's so fascinating that we actually, this is where like Paul, one might argue, is actually very progressive in terms of the way he's talking about the inclusion of various types and how there are weaker parts of the body. Like he talks about the fact that there are parts of and by this he's talking about the body of Christ, that other parts of the body have to care for and tend to. And it's a call for us to not only have compassion, but to create space, one might say universal design, actually, to use our contemporary language. And so as much as we can, and Lord knows we will criticize Paul about saying some stuff that is definitely suspect, like on this issue, there is like gospel text that is like so affirming that we can just overlook and forget because it doesn't fit into a broad narrative that we have of our own inability to be like, we don't want our kids to be disabled, we don't want to be disabled, and we want to pretend that disability doesn't exist, rather than changing the ways in which we engage disabled bodies. And if you have not read the book, My Body is Not a Prayer Request, I can't recommend it enough. Very accessible, very easy to read, and there's so much more I can recommend beyond that. But in terms of just an introductory way to help you think theologically about disability and kind of move past ableist language, I can't recommend that book enough.
And also the claim of religious exemption from some of these public health activities drives me crazy. That the fear of a child becoming disabled is greater than the fear of a child dying or one of their friends dying because of you choosing not to vaccinate your kids. And this was something that drove me absolutely insane during the height of the COVID pandemic when vaccines started coming out, and how people were claiming religious exemption from vaccinating themselves or their children against COVID, when COVID is a mass disabling event. Long COVID is, we have a lot of evidence now that lots of viruses can create disability. Polio was one example we've already talked about. COVID is a disabling virus. But also that there is anything in scripture that would argue we don't have the responsibility to care for our community and our siblings. So like people who refuse to mask because of their personal rights are like misunderstanding the point of the freedom of Christ. The freedom of Christ is not so you can do whatever the heck you want. The freedom of Christ is so that we are free to serve one another and love one another. That's what the freedom of Christ is about. And so people co-opt religious language to defend what are ultimately, I think, sinful individualist claims and ableist claims and racist claims, all sorts of things. When in reality, scripture much more supports our critical thinking to respond to scientific evidence in ways that is most beneficial for our local community, the people around us, and ourselves.
I think that the fear around having a disabled child makes a lot of sense. But the assumption that it's because something is wrong with the child, like the difficulties that might arise in one's life if your child is disabled, instead of blaming the society around you and noticing that that's because society is failing us, and blaming your child or your God or like whomever it might be, like placing blame at all as though, I don't know, just like, what if nothing is wrong with the person and what if everything is wrong with the world around them?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, absolutely. I love that because I think that's true. I think so much of it is the way in which we think and engage people. Like, obviously, women aren't the problem. Patriarchy is the problem, right? Like, it's pretty obvious. Racism isn't the problem. It's, the white folks want to have a certain kind of power over other bodies. You know what I mean? That's the issue. And so much of it is the way we engage. I want to say a couple things before we move on. And because both of you have made points that I've had to take some notes about, so I want to come back to at some point, and I haven't found an easy way to weave them in, but I think they're really important. Blair, you had mentioned this, question about like, would you change, would someone willingly change their particular kind of disability and whatnot? And so I grew up with a grandmother that's disabled, and that would have been while I have other people in my family who are disabled. My father is also disabled. My grandmother was the one who had the most severe disability in terms of having a stroke, and I think in losing the ability to talk and to walk well, and just so much of her life changed after having a severe stroke, and she was in the bathroom, and we think she was in there for roughly around 40 minutes, which, as you know, with a stroke, it's like every minute like matters. It changed our lives forever. It changed my grandma's relationship. I thought it changed my grandma's relationship with God. What I actually realized is it changed my grandma's relationship with church, not God. Because my grandma she still read the Bible every day. She still kept doing all these things that were deeply theologically enriching for her. Like, she would watch church on TV. Again, she read the Bible. She couldn't really speak, but she read like different books that were about theology. But she stopped going to church because the church was not accessible for her anymore. And it wasn't until that we understood collectively, we need to actually have a ramp there. We need to have, because it was an older church. And so we had to actually build in the accommodations. And she wanted to be an usher again, which is what she was before she had a stroke. And it wasn't until I was a teenager and like being able to listen to her. And this is where patriarchy does come in, because my grandpa really wasn't like, to understand, this is why she doesn't want to go to church. It's not because she doesn't want to go to church. It's because the church doesn't want, as Julia said, to change the way it's doing to accommodate her. And when they changed, she went back and loved going to church. And so she didn't have, and I'm sure she wrestled with God about why this happened, but her primary concern was being able to go to be in community and worship. And I think if we could think about it from that perspective, as Julia said, it could drastically alter the way we think and talk about disability theologically, including neurological disabilities, intellectual disabilities like autism. The other thing I want to say in terms of like, would you change? So I have ADHD. I was diagnosed with ADHD as a child, and took medicine for it when I was a kid for a little bit, then stopped because at that time, I'm a child of the early 80s. And so the medicine was Ritalin and just did not work well with me. And I felt like I couldn't really think quickly enough to move. And what I've come to find out with the medicine I take now is I just don't respond well to stimulants. Non-stimulants work just much better for me. I'm sharing this to say that now, having read so much more about disability and learning more about how I think and how my brain works, I have no doubt that if I had been evaluated for autism, if we weren't a poor Black family, in rural Michigan, that I would have been diagnosed as autistic, because all of these challenges that kids have are challenges that I had. Like, I didn't go to college until I was in my mid 20s because I was not, like, my executive function, like the deficits that I had. But once I was able to figure out ways to work with my brain rather than against it, it just radically changed my capacities. And I went from having a C to being a C average student to just being an A student, like, graduating. I mean, I think I ain't trying to brag, but I'll be honest, I got like, I got
You
two A
have
minus.
a
Yeah, I mean,
PhD now, so
yeah. Well, I mean, I got two A minuses in my undergrad, and I got one A minus out of all graduate school. Like, everything else was A's, because like at this point, I knew how to work with my brain, and for so long, I was frustrated because I kept trying to do things the way other people were telling me how to do it. Because they were telling me to do something this particular way, to think this kind of way, and I just see and experience the world differently. And if you'd have asked me, like when I was in my early 20s, if I could not have ADHD, I would have said yes. But now that I've learned how to work with my brain, I have the privilege of reading all this stuff, I wouldn't change it because I understand how to. I think it would change too much of me and how I understand myself, and it has made me fundamentally a much more compassionate person. And so the idea of forced cures, when people are using religious exemptions to opt out of, getting a vaccine, just is ridiculous. What's happening in Texas is ridiculous because to me, it's not loving your neighbor. It's not loving your child to say, oh, I'm willing to sacrifice them for the sake of a fear of being disabled. I'm going to sacrifice them, and that it's okay that they're in a better place. I just don't believe that's actual. I don't believe that's actual love. I think it's like what we talked about last week. I think that's abuse. I would argue it is complex PTSD, and it is mistreatment. And for those of us who would have wanted to have more children, I particularly find it frustrating. To be fair, to be transparent, that is also a part of this for me as someone who wanted to have more than one child. And I've come to realize that if I had two kids like Isaiah, that'd be one too many. So maybe, maybe one would, maybe God was doing something when he's like, she was like, I think you might just do one. I think you might just do one. So, um, I wanted to make the hard pivot to, uh, we wanted to end the podcast today by kind of, I guess, maybe more or less announcing, I don't know if you want to say like a new segment where we're going to do like once a month, with mini-sodes, that we're going to maybe record maybe once or twice a month. We don't know. Letters, or like, I don't know.
Ask
What did
the
you,
progressive Christians.
yeah, no,
Ask the progressive
Letters from
Christians.
listeners.
no,
We'll come up with a cute name
mailbag.
for
You
it.
called it a
We're
mailbag. Yeah, did you say?
we're workshopping it.
We're workshopping the name. We're going to come up with a cool name that we're going to be able to talk more about. But we actually have an updated email address, progressivechristians@theloftla.org. I will put this all in the show notes, because we've been getting emails, and a couple of them, we've been able to respond to. One of which we want to talk about today because it was a question that I thought, oh wow, I think other folks probably have this question too. And so, we want and invite y'all to send in just either theological questions, like things that you're trying to talk to somebody about, or things you've been grappling with or wrestling with. Please share them with us. And once we get a few, we'll do a little episode where we kind of give you our, takes on them, I guess, so to speak. And I think it'll be really a way for us to not only engage you, but to be able to answer. As I said when I was a professor, there are no dumb questions. I firmly believe that there are not dumb questions. Like the question you have, other people probably have too. And so having the courage to answer it, or ask it, just know that we will handle that question with compassion and care. And that we won't, this is not a space of blame, shame, or judgment. Rather, this space of openness and curiosity. So I'm going to read just a section because we want to obviously anonymize stuff for people because this could be from anyone. But the email said, my mother's a wonderful person and she is quite liberal. Thinking of what Trump is doing to people makes her cry. However, she did grow up in a more conservative Christian home, and some of the things she tells me from the Bible just don't sit well with me. Today, we're talking about verses that speak of God hardening the hearts of those who turn against him. I told her that it just doesn't make sense to me. It felt like such petty behavior that isn't of God. I have looked up where it is in the Bible, but I was curious of y'all's take on that. And so I'm just curious, kind of what came up for y'all as you were thinking about this and trying to essentially reconcile, the way, essentially what she's trying to do is reconcile Jesus, the way we talk and think about Jesus versus the God we see in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. So I have a specific response to this because it came up in my Hebrew Bible class. And this idea of God hardening the hearts comes from the book of Exodus when the Pharaoh is denying the release of the Israelites over and over and over again. And after every plague, Moses goes to the Pharaoh and says, will you let my people go? And the Pharaoh says no. And it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And so it is directly from scripture, right? God hardened Pharaoh's heart. What is required to understand that is the context of the ancient Near East and Egyptian religion. Because in Egyptian religion, there was an understanding that pharaohs were godlike and that when they died, they joined the pantheon of gods, if you will. And one of the ways that you decided kind of what afterlife you ended up in is that your heart would be removed and weighed. And if your heart was as light as a feather, then you would go to like the best version of the afterlife. But if your heart was too heavy, then you would go to some kind of like Sheol, death, hell type thing. And so basically, what that phrase over and over again of Pharaoh hardened, or God hardened Pharaoh's heart, is about basically God saying, this is a mark against Pharaoh that can't be undone. His inability to show mercy is not just going to harm him now, but it is going to harm him in the hereafter forever. And so we use the phrase hardened heart as like that as your heart becomes harder, you are less likely to be compassionate. But in the Egyptian context, it's your heart becomes hardened when you fail to be compassionate and loving. And so it was basically a way of saying God in that moment was judging Pharaoh in a way that was really severe. And this is what happens when we don't read the Bible in context, and when we don't read the Bible together, we miss out on these little contextual things. And then when we just pull out pieces that become sort of catchphrases, they take on a life of their own, and without context, come to have completely different meanings. And so this is one of those. And a lot of things that are hard in the Bible, that we struggle with in the Bible, have some way of making sense when we put them back in context and we read them in community. So that's my like little mini Hebrew Bible, ancient Near Eastern religion lesson for us all.
That was amazing.
That was amazing. I didn't know that. So that was amazing.
Was incredible.
I'm like, wow. I mean, I just preached on Exodus, as you well both know, because Julia watched it online and you were there. And so, one thing is so critical when reading text from the Hebrew Bible is understanding that it was written for readers who would have a deep understanding of the other religions around them, because they're always referencing other religions. Like on Sunday's text was referencing two other religions, the text we read, and I was, but I don't have the time to go into all those nuances. But it was written with people with the idea that the readers would have known what was happening, what was being said, and it's just lost on us because these are religions that people aren't practiced anymore. And when you read the words, you don't know they're talking about another religious tradition. I want to say something briefly about the reconciling Jesus with the God of the Hebrew Bible. And in this, I say I'm particularly inspired by the work of Richard Rohr in his book, The Divine Dance. So Richard Rohr is a Franciscan priest. And what he talks about in terms of how we read the Bible is a fundamental recognition that humans wrote the Bible. While these humans were inspired by God. Often it's what they're writing is a reflection of their own understanding of God at the time. And they're writing it in the rears. They're writing it to interpret what has happened in the past. And they're trying to make sense of their life and their circumstances through the context of the divine. And so he sees the Bible much more as a conversation between humanity and the sacred, in as much as their understanding of God in those moments is often a reflection of their experience of God their experience of God at that current moment, rather than who God is or how we understand God to be. And to me, that makes sense. It helps create some distance between people that were, for the most part, writing the Hebrew Bible under colonial occupation, thinking of God as a God of judgment. That makes sense because they're like, how can we explain how we got here? Right? It's necessary for them to understand how we got to this point where we were free people. And now we don't have the kind of freedom we wanted to have. Versus when you get to Jesus, who's saying, actually, true freedom is a radical, transformation of the way we conceptualize and think about God. True freedom is how we understand that God lives within us. God, is all around us. It's about how we relate to other human beings, how we relate to non-human nature. True freedom is actually recognizing that what makes us pure isn't our adherence to these strict purity laws. Rather, it's our relationship with each other. And that purity, in a sense, is contagious rather than something to be kept to ourselves. And it's just a fundamental shift. And so Jesus is this marked shift in the way we think about God versus the God of the Hebrew Bible. Jesus is interpreting the God of the Hebrew Bible and saying this is actually a, from Jesus' perspective, more accurate understanding of how we live out this understanding of the sacred. And so for me, I just see Jesus as a way of thinking about the God of the Hebrew Bible in a more not only approachable form, but a more in a form that in a way that's reflective of who we are created to be as human beings on earth, rather than how we might think about who God is and how God is from a character perspective. Because I just don't think it was written with that in mind. That's what I do in terms of how I think about it. Blair, I know you have to leave, and so we're gonna go ahead and let you go to your
I'm
next
gonna say
meeting.
goodbye now, but Julia, I will stay in and listen as long as I can because I want to know what you would say to this reader as well.
Exactly, that's what I was going to
Listener.
say.
I'm not a professional. I don't know that I would say any. I would say you should talk to Reverend Blair and Dr. Carter.
Yeah, but what do you do? I mean, you read scripture, you engage with these texts, you think about how in worship to help people understand the theological underpinnings, the meaning of these stories. How do you do it?
Pass.
You actually interpret the sacred, I would argue. So I mean, it's so funny because you said something about this almost maybe it was 2 weeks ago. How watching Jesus Christ Superstar gave you a particular way of understanding theology differently and understanding the context of the Bible differently in terms of how people understood Jesus. I actually think the way you reconcile the Hebrew Bible version of God and the contemporary version of Jesus is for you is a prioritization of God in human form in Christ. And that gave you an understanding of what it means for us to, how we are to think about God and how it means for us to practice the religion of Jesus. That's how I interpret and experience you actually thinking about these things. So I know that's not what you said, but that's what you actually do. So in case you didn't know.
Like stumped. I'm fully stumped. I it is very important to me in my faith, yes, to like conceive of like I like thinking of Jesus as an actual person. That's like the most fascinating thing about all of it to me. That it is God having a human experience and what that means. Like a man who was ticklish and who had a favorite color and a favorite food and who like all of the most mundane things that we do. And to me, I think that's the most holy. But what you said, that's me. Yep.
That's you.
So profound.
That's also
You've
you.
never stumped me. I'm over here like,
Huh? Well,
je ne sais pas.
I mean, when I guess by way of wrapping up, I will say one of the challenges that I think that we have discussed, that perhaps a way to think about this question is how do you talk to your parents about the things you disagree with theologically? And I think that is like a part of this question as well. And I know for me, you know, my mom to an extent tends to defer to me on a lot of these conversations because of my expertise, and so that makes it a little bit different. But that doesn't mean she necessarily will in the conversation agreeing with me, as much as I try to understand the point she's trying to make and where she's trying to come from. I always want to approach it from an understanding perspective. I don't want to make her feel bad or feel like she's not smart for having a particular opinion or perspective. So I always try to come at it from an understanding, like, oh, that makes sense. I can see why you get that. And then I will respond with like this is how I think this might be a more helpful and a better way to think about this context and why think about this passage or this idea, this belief, and why that's the case. Um, but I always try to do it in a way that doesn't. I don't want somebody to feel like I'm trying to shame them for having their belief, and I want to give them space to change their mind if they want to or not change their mind. Um, but it is hard when it's a parent child because there's a shift that takes place when you become a little bit more of an expert on certain things than your parents, and that's not easy for some parents to reconcile. So
For the most part, a lot of my beliefs come directly from my parents. Like we don't really disagree My dad will say something sometimes, but not because it's what he believes. He likes to,
Be provocateur.
oh my gosh. And I'll be like, don't ever say that to me again. And he'll be like, he thinks it's so funny.
Well, whenever I talk to your mom, we never end up talking theology. She always just wants to talk about, like, something that's going on in your life. But that's private off pod stuff. So
She does. Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean,
I love Mrs. Black. If you listen to the podcast, I have to at least say that just in case.
Mrs. Black is great. Mrs. Black is great. No, she and I agree a lot on theology. She is where I got a lot of my beliefs from. She studied it briefly at like Moody Bible College, and I grew up in a house filled with books, a lot of theological books, and so this apple doesn't fall that far from the tree.
There we go. So we will have a more robust announcement. We'll talk more about this. Probably actually put something in the show notes as well. And we'll be excited actually to have hopefully at least one episode a month, if not probably two, depending on the number of emails we get. We can kind of address some of these questions that we get, and some of them, to be fair, some of y'all's comments on Spotify, especially. Have led us to even create some episodes we have done. And now that I'm sure I'll see some comments on YouTube as well, where we can come up with episodes based on what people are saying. So if you're have an idea or curious or something you want us to talk about, please let us know. And if you have a question, again, please reach out to us at progressivechristians@theloftla.org. Well, I want to thank you all for listening to the Progressive Christians podcast. The Progressive Christian podcast is a ministry of The Loft, a worship community of West William Methodist Church. If you'd like to find us, you can connect with us on social media, on TikTok, on Instagram, and on YouTube at The Progressive Christians. You can email us your questions, as I said earlier, at progressivechristians@theloftla.org. And we are grateful that our show is edited and mixed by our wonderful audio engineer, AJ Goodlow. If you like the show, please rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using. If you watch us on YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks for listening or watching, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.